Right, welcome ladies and gents. Johnny Depp's team has come out swinging with Miss Hughes, the doctor, Dr. Hughes, and they call her out on all of her insane biases, and they make it clear to the jury that, yeah, no, she had only taken Amber Heard's word for it. There's no interaction with Johnny Depp at all. How can you assess a relationship when you're only speaking with one party? So this is just a quick highlight. This was the opening statements and questions from Johnny Depp's side. They really do obliterate Miss Hughes. She's quite smart in terms of the way she's replying to it by saying, well, you know, I was just taking it with respect to the relationship at hand. But actually, Dr. Hughes, those weren't the questions you were answered. You were asking very broad questions. You chose to do that. You chose to mention women as victims more so. Well, actually, you didn't mention men being victims at all. So it's very cold, calculated, but I do appreciate Johnny Depp's team coming out and absolutely slam dunking on Amber Heard. So enjoy this quick highlight from today.
All right, cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Hughes. I'm Wayne Dennis, and we haven't met before.
No, good morning.
Good morning. You testified yesterday that you have to give careful attention to gendered stereotypes, correct?
That is correct.
When you're talking about intimate partner violence, you have to pay attention to gendered stereotypes. And during your testimony, you in fact paid attention to gendered stereotypes, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, you said we were going to have to pay attention to gendered stereotypes, and then you testified at length where you referenced both men and women. You paid attention to those stereotypes during the course of your testimony, correct?
What I was saying was you have to pay attention to gendered stereotypes when you're conducting these evaluations. You can't assume all the time that the male is the perpetrator and the female is the victim. You have to go into the evaluation understanding that the male also could be the victim of intimate partner violence.
In fact, you're aware that there are large-scale studies that do say that IPV towards males does exist.
Of course.
Okay. And every time you referred to the characteristic of a victim of intimate partner violence yesterday, you used the pronouns she or her, didn't you?
I was using the she and her pronouns in this case because my determination was, as I stated, that Ms. Heard was the victim of intimate partner violence. That is why I was using the she, her pronouns.
You, in fact, said women gets into the relationship for all the right reasons. That's what you said. The woman gets into the relationship for all the right reasons. And then you say difficult for victim to extricate herself. You go on to say that she can and she should. Over and over, you use she, right?
I believe in this case I did because I was referencing this case where I found Ms. Heard to be the victim of intimate partner violence. It doesn't mean that men don't get into the relationships for all the right reasons too. I believe they do.
Nearly every time you referenced the perpetrator of IPV, you used he or him, didn't you?
And it goes back to the same reasoning as I'm describing my understanding and my evaluation in this matter. Of course, men can be perpetrators and victims of intimate partner violence. That's well established in the research, and that's well established in my clinical practice as well.
Isn't the reason that you used the pronouns that you did that you almost always testify on behalf of a woman?
That's not correct.
You don't even remember the last time you testified on behalf of a man.
Well, I don't testify on behalf of someone. I testify as to the results of my evaluation. I frequently treat and assess male victims of childhood sexual abuse who are coming into treatment for abuse by their Boy Scout leader, by their coach, by their teacher, by a trusted adult. I see them in therapy. I see them in forensic matters, in criminal cases. So I treat and evaluate men all the time.
I didn't ask you about treatment. I asked you about testimony. You broke out your practice between treatment and testimony. I'm not asking about treatment. When's the last time you testified on behalf of a man?
I testified recently in a deposition on behalf of a man who was traumatized because he was wrongly convicted.
At the time of your deposition 6 weeks ago, you couldn't remember a single time you had testified on behalf of a man.
I testified in my deposition that I testified in a case of a man who was wrongly convicted about 20 years and suffered physical and sexual violence in prison, and I detailed the traumatic effects of that happened on that gentleman.
All right, why don't we take a look at your deposition?
Sure.
All right. Transcript of the deposition that you gave March 28th, 2022, correct?
Yes.
All right. Let's go to page 77. Page 78, line 8. So you can't recall a single instance where you were hired by the attorney representing the male in an IPV matter, correct?
In an IPV matter, not in a trauma matter or a child sexual abuse matter.
Okay, so that's the distinction. You don't have any recollection of ever testifying on behalf of a male in an IPV matter.
As I stated yesterday, the very first case that I testified in was in a same-sex intimate partner violence where the man was the victim of another man. I routinely treat and assess same-sex couples where then the female can be the perpetrator of another female, and the male can be the perpetrator or a victim of his partner.
So let me get this. You testified in a case where one male is alleged to have engaged in IPV against another male.
Correct.
All right. Okay. But that's the only one you remember. That's the only one you remember.
No, I've done this frequently. As you well know, most cases don't go to trial. I've worked on hundreds and hundreds of cases. You've limited to testimony. Many cases don't come to trial, but I've issued reports and worked on many cases of same-sex intimate partner violence where men are the victims.
But I did ask you about testimony, and I limited the question to testimony, and the only testimony that you remember is the same-sex couple, right?
There were multiple same-sex couples, I believe, that I testified
That you testified in court at trial.
I believe so, yes.
All right, but you didn't remember that in March.
I did remember that in March.
Okay. How'd you get engaged?
Engaged?
How'd you get hired to do this work?
I was contacted by the legal team.
All right, were you interviewed by her legal team as to whether you were going to testify here?
I was not.
You were not interviewed.
I was not.
You were contacted.
Correct.
Had you worked with that legal team before?
I had.
Yeah. So they already knew who you were, right?
Correct.
Right. And at any time that you were working with Ms. Hurd or assessing Ms. Hurd, she could have chose to fire you, correct?
I suppose her legal team could have chose to fire her. I was not her. She is not my client. The legal team is the one who hires me. I am responsible to the legal team, not Ms. Hurd.
And the legal team that hired you already knew who you were because you worked together previously.
And clearly they knew of my expertise in this area of intimate partner violence and traumatic stress, which is why they contacted me to work on this matter.
You talked to Ms. Hurd for, what, approximately 30 hours, right?
Correct.
How long have you spent with Mr. Depp?
I did not spend any time with Mr. Depp. It was my understanding that he did not sit for a psychological evaluation.
Right. In fact, you never met Mr. Depp, have you?
I have not.
But you purport to be able to assess the relationship between Mr. Depp and Ms. Hurd?
But I also read Mr. Depp's transcripts of his testimony. I watched his deposition testimony. I reviewed his medical records. I reviewed his text messages. So it's not necessarily totally blind. I did have information, although I'm not making a conclusion about Mr. Depp himself.